UFC 200, the card that was set to eclipse all other cards, both past, present, and future. The card that was supposed to go down in history as the greatest event in combat sports history. Years on, however, it's lost in the increasingly vast sea of great MMA events, remembered more for its controversies than its impact on combat sports. But looking back, what went wrong? Welcome to this series where we'll be taking a look back at major cards throughout MMA history, having a brief look at the history and the background, but most importantly, at how well they've aged. If you enjoy this format, consider liking and subscribing. If you'd like anything fleshed out more in the future videos, let me know in the comments so I can adjust. Without further ado, UFC 200. Set for the 9th of July 2016 at the close of International Fight Week, and preceded by two incredible fight cards that would see Joanna Jędrzejczyk defend her belt against tough rival coach Claudia Gadelha, and Eddie Alvarez capture the lightweight title from then champion Rafael dos Anjos. What should have been the UFC's most memorable event is now remembered mostly for the shit show that it became in the final weeks leading up to this flagship event. UFC 200, when announced, was originally scheduled to be headlined by the much anticipated welterweight rematch between featherweight champion Conor McGregor and lightweight standout Nate Diaz, set to run back their now legendary and box office breaking first clash at UFC 196. That wouldn't last long, however, as after some very public scheduling disputes which would see McGregor retire, the pairing was scrapped, publicly announced by Dana White on the 19th of April, after a tense few days of wondering if any of the other title fights on the card would be elevated to headline this historic event. It was announced that Daniel Cormier would unify the light heavyweight title against rival and incumbent interim champion Jon Jones on the 27th of April, alongside a classic UFC press conference, although the majority of questions were fielded to Dana White about Conor's absence. Skip forward to June the 4th at UFC 199. Ariel Helwani breaks the news shortly before the UFC managers to, that Brock Lesnar will be making his UFC return, his first fight in almost 5 years, at UFC 200. That's a whole other controversy which we won't cover here, we're dealing with enough. Long story short, Helwani was banned for breaking the news and then was shortly allowed back into the UFC events. Anyway, with both the light heavyweight title fight and the return of Jon Jones, surely the relevant star power had been added to replace Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz, right? Well, that's what we all thought too, until days before the event when disaster would strike again. As if the MMA gods had particular hatred for this particular event. Less than 3 days before UFC 200, at the start of International Fight Week, it was revealed that Jon Jones had popped for a performance-enhancing drug and would be pulled from the main event. This would lead to a mad scramble by the UFC to refine a replacement and to finalise a main event. The amount of posters that were produced in the next few days is truly mind-blowing. Every title fight, and even the Brock Lesnar-Mark Hunt pairing, briefly saw itself at the head of the bill, before eventually the women's bantamweight matchup between Miesha Tate and Amanda Nunes was finalised as the headliner. Eventually, during the broadcast of the Dos Anjos fight, it was announced that former middleweight champion and GOAT contender Anderson Silva would be stepping in to replace Jon Jones and face Daniel Cormier in a light heavyweight non-title bout, with the caveat of a legit title shot in a rematch should he be victorious. Right, I think that's all of it. The card itself still ended up being pretty stacked, and realistically, it's aged pretty well too in terms of its star power. Literally every fight on that card was more than capable of holding its own as a fight night headliner, maybe with the exception of Sage Northcutt at the time. But from the early prelims of Jim Miller vs Takanori Gomi, Gegard Mousasi vs Thiago Santos, and Joe Lozon vs Diego Sanchez, prelims of Sage Northcutt during his initial UFC push versus Enrique Marin, TJ Dillashaw in a rematch with Rafael Assunção, Kelvin Gastelum taking on Johnny Hendricks, capped off with Juliana Pena taking on a returning Kat Zingano. The main card, as it eventually ended up, consisted of Cain Velasquez returning for his first bout in years against Travis Brown, Jose Aldo rematching Frankie Edgar for the interim featherweight belt, Daniel Cormier taking on Anderson Silva in a non-title bout, and Brock Lesnar returning against Mark Hunt in the co-main event. And to top it all off, Miesha Tate would defend her bantamweight title against Amanda Nunes. The card itself played out okay. It wasn't a barn burner, but it wasn't horrible. The early prelims kicked off fast, with Jim Miller, Gegard Mousasi and Joe Lozon all securing first round knockouts respectively. What followed was a little lackluster to say the least. Opening up, we had Sage Northcutt versus Enrique Marin, in what wasn't an overly interesting fight in the first place. Didn't exactly scream fight of the night. In a fight most of us didn't think should be on such a historic card in the first place, it was lackluster at best. Dillashaw Sunsao was more of the same, with Dillashaw comfortably picking apart Sunsao from the outside for the duration. Gastelum vs Johnny Hendricks had one of the longest clinch fights I've ever seen in MMA history, and Juliana Pena did what she did best. Leading into the main card, we were coming off 4 decisions in a row. Luckily, Cain Velasquez had heard our call and came out like a bat out of hell, and for the last time, we got to see a vintage Velasquez performance, and even threw a picture-perfect wheel kick as the cherry on top. Aldo and Edgar repeated their Matador game that was their first bout, which would see Aldo comfortably cruise to a decision and capture the interim featherweight belt. He would later be promoted to undisputed champion after Conor McGregor was stripped due to inactivity. Now this is where the card gets a bit weird. Daniel Cormier comes out against Anderson Silva and did what everyone and their dogs knew what he was going to do. He put Anderson Silva straight on his back and smothered him with wrestling and short ground and pound to get the win, and the crowd hated it. Next up, Brock Lesnar came out and utilised the exact same strategy to grind out a decision over Mark Hunt, and the crowd loved it. MMA fans, eh? To round out the night, we got a real treat. We got to see a vintage and what would now become legendary Amanda Nunes performance. Nunes really introduced herself to the larger MMA stage with this win. After absolutely lighting up Miesha Tate on the feet and dropping her, she would secure the rear naked choke to take the bantamweight strap, and with it she would begin her run to her current status as the women's GOAT. But how did it all age? In my opinion, UFC 200 is one of the rare cards that has aged beautifully as time has gone on. I mean, even if we start with the prelims, following UFC 200, Gegard Mousasi would go on a run which would see him become one of the top-ranked middleweights in the UFC, before swapping over to Bellator where he would become the champion. Thiago Santos, we've all seen the run he's gone on the light heavyweights. TJ Dillashaw would go on to recapture his belt. Kelvin Gastelum would move up in weight, and we'd see him contend for the interim belt at middleweight. Juliana Pena has secured herself as a top contender at bantamweight now. And need I say anything more about everyone else on that card? I think, looking back as a conclusion, UFC 200, it's almost a shame. What could have been the greatest card in MMA history, and what would still be fondly remembered as one of the greatest cards of all time, was so mired in controversy and lost so much of its star power over time, coupled with a few lackluster performances, and it's no wonder it doesn't hold as special a place in our hearts as it should. If you're new to MMA, this is still a card I would recommend you go back and watch. There are some great fights on there, there's some great performances, and as I've previously mentioned, if you want your last chance to see Cain Velasquez for what he was, this is the time to do it. I don't know, let me know what you think in the comments, guys. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and let me know which card you want me to cover next.